Seeing this model name probably gives you a good clue about this case. Corsair 2000D Airflow. But just to be safe, let's give you a very brief history lesson. I have previously reviewed the Corsair iQ7000X RGB. It was a huge case costing just over £300 and I gave it a worth considering award. Then we had the Corsair 5000D Airflow, a large ATX case costing £165. That scored worth buying. We saw a variant of the 5000D called the 5000T RGB. Hugely expensive at £365, festooned with lighting. I didn't much like it. That got a worth considering. The champion of Corsair Thousands series of cases is the 4000D Airflow. Launched all the way back in September 2020, priced under £100. It's a compact mid-tower case. Taking all that information together, we understand the bigger the number, the bigger the case, the smaller the number, the smaller the case. Pricing, that's a bit variable. So this Corsair 2000D Airflow, it's £110 here in the UK, including VAT, and it's Mini-ITX and it supports an SFX power supply. No doubt you're wondering, why is a Mini-ITX case so tall? That doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? Well, this Mini-ITX case has a small footprint and can support a 360mm AIO liquid cooler. Well, that's unusual. Let's take off the panels and we'll see what's going on inside. 2 thumb screws for this left-hand panel. Pop loose and away. Same on the right hand side. Top cover held on with magnets. Front cover pops loose. And around on the rear we have a dust filter that slides up. Magnets, and it sits in these grooves so it's not going anywhere. And here we can see some hook and loop straps which will secure the mains power cable. Also on the top of the case. This Airflow version of the 2000D case ironically comes without any fans whatsoever, and I think that explains the relatively low ticket price. We can install the 360mm cooler up to 360 in this side location. The front we can install 3 120mm fans. This is the motherboard tray. In the rear we can install a 240mm cooler if we choose, or 2 120mm fans, so potentially 2 fans in the rear, 3 in the side, 3 in the front. This 2000D Airflow case costs £110 here in the UK. There's a £150 variant which comes with 3 ARGB fans, these new AF120 Slim models. So that's a £40 premium you're paying. However, the fans, if you buy them individually, will cost you £25 for one, or £60 for 2, because you get one of Corsair's lighting node core units in this box. So add those two together, that's 60 plus 25, £85 of fans, which is obviously a huge percentage of the total cost. If you're thinking of buying fans such as these, to go in this case, for goodness sake, get that RGB version. Why, you may wonder, are these AF120mm RGB slim fans called that? Well, it's because they're 120mm, they've got RGB, and they're 15mm in thickness or thinness, hence the slim. The front I/O is at the foot of the case. The idea is that the case sits on your desk where this is easily accessible. Power and reset buttons, 2 USB Type A's, 1 USB Type C. The SFX power supply goes in the roof of the case, and then the cables hang down. Mains cord feeds through there. The motherboard will be installed here, rotated 90 degrees. The graphics card goes in this location here, and in essence is upside down, so it goes into those mounts there and then goes upwards, which means that you're connecting cables through this point here. I think it's going to make much more sense if we start putting some hardware inside the 2000D Airflow and see what it looks like. We'll start with the motherboard assembly. It's a Gigabyte B650i Aorus Ultra, obviously Mini-ITX, which means it's incredibly compact. We have a Sabrent Rocket 4.0 SSD in place, and an AMD Ryzen 7 7700X. Let's put the heatsink on the SSD. Install some Corsair Vengeance DDR5 memory, 32GB 5200, relatively slow DDR5. The thing is, as I got the bits and pieces ready for this review, I realised I've got all manner of 6000 mega transfer DDR5 memory. I've got faster Corsair memory, which is good for Intel, but not good for AMD. Worth pointing out, Mini-ITX has restrictions and limitations. We've got headers and connectors all over this gigabyte board, but we still have to use a few dongles to make further connections. It's one of the limitations of ITX. You either have very few features or they get complicated, and complicated tends to mean expensive. So this motherboard has a single 8-pin EPS at the top of the board, which is absolutely fine. Next to it, a CPU PWM fan header. There is one other header, and it's this here. And to make that work, we have to use this dongle. Slightly peculiarly, you won't see any front panel connector pins like you'd expect, at least for the power button and the reset, possibly for hard drive activity, SSD activity, and to show power. This little connection point here is for this little PCB, which gives you SATA ×4 and also the front panel headers. There we go. Also USB 2. We have headers for USB 3.2 Type A and Type C. But to add USB 2 requires this dongle. And there we go, a modern Mini-ITX motherboard with AMD Ryzen 7. I'm going to be using a Corsair AIO, so let's remove the stock AMD retention system and install these 4 threaded standoffs. Motherboard assembly ready. And let's give ourselves a bit of extra working room by removing this radiator fan rack. As I mentioned, the motherboard is rotated. So it goes in like that, which means the graphics slot is over to that side and the front panel I/O is facing downwards, as you can see. Let's talk about storage. As you've seen, I'm using an M.2 SSD. I have storage whatever I want, more storage. No optical drive. No support for 3.5-inch hard drives either. 2.5-inch SSD is the only option. This case has 3 mounting locations for SSDs and you get 2 bays, so to speak. And that means here we have a mount, and you can, if you choose, move that mount to the upper position. I'm fairly sure you can buy an accessory from Corsair for presumably very few pounds, and then you can install 2 SATA SSDs side by side. That's one SSD. The other goes in this location here. We have 4 holes in the top of the case, and there we have it. 2 SATA SSDs installed. If you buy an accessory bay, you can put a 3rd drive in. No trouble at all installing plenty of SSD storage in this compact case. And now it's time to come to the power supply. SFX or SFXL, and we remove these 2 screws here and these 2 screws at the top of the motherboard, and out comes the power supply housing, complete with that SSD bay. And our chosen power supply is a Corsair SF600. This is another limitation in my mind of this case, the restriction to SFX, SFXL power supplies. For one thing, they tend to be more expensive than regular ATX. For another, you're paying more certainly for the same wattage. 600 watts in SFX is these days actually not particularly high end. On the shelf behind me, I have a 650 watt Seasonic, and a 750 watt Silverstone SFX power supply. You can easily get 1000, I think 1200 watt SFX, and also if you want to support the latest graphics cards you probably want ATX3 with the new 12 volt high power connector. We're not going down that particular route. Corsair SF600 for me. That's the power supply installed and the caddy back in place. It's fairly close for comfort despite the case being rather tall. Partly it's odd because the motherboard's rotated, which means the headers and connectors are in unusual positions. The graphics card's going to occupy a significant part of the interior, and then of course we have a liquid cooler going on the CPU. We have this pass-through power cable here with a right angled, let's get this the right way around. That's a socket. That's the plug. So that goes on the power supply. And then we feed the cable through these hook and loop straps down the back, and then the regular mains cable will connect to it in the standard way. There. The next step is a graphics card. I've chosen this Sapphire RX 6800 XT partly because I haven't used it for a while and it seems like a shame to let it just gather dust. It's also a good size for this case. It gives me the pleasure of doing an AMD on AMD build, and it happens to have two 8-pin connectors and isn't monstrously overpowered, so the 600 watt power supply should have a fighting chance with this combination of hardware. Nice and solid, and we've got air intake within a centimetre of the fans on the graphics card. CPU cooler is this Corsair H150i Elite LCD. So it's a 360mm AIO. And we've got a whole tangle of spaghetti that goes off to this commander unit and also hooks up to the LCD screen on the pump body. Not that I expect to see anything of the LCD once the hardware's in place. Let's put some Arctic MX4 on the Ryzen 7 7700X. Now you can't see very much from that angle at the moment. I'm about to turn everything around once I've got these two thumb screws in place, which is the nature of this case. Actually very interesting. It has significant openings because we don't have any fans installed on this side, so I'm actually able to reach in from here to access the nuts that hold down the pump body. ITX is always fiddly regardless. Clearly a large ITX chassis gives you more working room. But this airflow case that has no fans installed in the front at the moment is very straightforward in this respect. Okay, now let's bring this in. Take the cables as we go. Let's give you a view of this. I can see why Corsair is including slim fans with the RGB version in this case. The amount of space is diminishing. As you will doubtless guess from the RGB show at the front of the case, I've installed the 3 slim RGB fans. So let's wrap up this review, firstly with some testing. I ran in two configurations, and these are very quick and dirty tests indeed. In the first configuration I had the 3 fans on the AIO cooler, and that was it. And I left Corsair's IQ software to its own devices in balanced mode, and it sounded like this. Now that's clearly audible, but it's not problematic. It is worth bearing in mind, however, the PC is almost certainly going to be next to you on your desk. So if you're going to thrash it really hard with just the basic configuration of fans on your cooler, I think you'll be able to hear what's going on. Not saying it's a problem, it's something to be aware of. The PC was drawing 410 watts at the wall socket, running a combination of Temps by stress test and Cinebench R23. The CPU is drawing 140 watts, running at 5.1 GHz all cores, just over 5.1, and the GPU 180 watts and running at 1.5 GHz. After that, I installed the 3 fans in the front of the case. Now we've got 6 Corsair fans, connected them all to the same control hub, still on balanced profile, and it sounded like this. And yes, it is essentially silent. The PC draw was now 425 watts at the wall socket, which suggests it's able to use slightly more power. Processor still pulling 140 watts. Temperature down a fraction at 94. Ambient here is a mildly warm 22. The GPU still pulling 180 watts and 1.5 gigahertz. I noticed the temperature went up slightly, 70 Celsius. So I imagine there's something going on with the way the air is flowing inside the chassis. In the great scheme of things, adding the extra fans didn't really make a lot of odds, except it made the PC slightly quieter. And now let's look at my pros and cons, my conclusions about the Corsair 2000D airflow. Pros, the good points. It's got a small footprint, and that's great if you want to put the PC on your desk. There's plenty of room for, I've written, the largest graphics card. I'm sure somebody's going to find a quad slot longer graphics card that won't fit in this case, but pretty much anything will fit. And it's got good airflow. There's mesh all over the place. Admittedly, I've got cables in the middle of the case, but the airflow is good. Cons, the negatives. Your choice of motherboard is limited to Mini-ITX. That's always been problematic. These days there are fewer ITX boards around, so that is something to watch out for. Secondly, the internal cable clutter requires care during the build. You may have noticed I'm not waving a user manual, user guide around for this case. I don't have one. It's one of those cases apparently where you get a QR code and Corsair does not have the manual listed on their website. I've asked for a copy, I've asked a couple of times, haven't got it. It's perfectly possible I haven't followed some fine point of Corsair's build guide, because I haven't seen it. Cable clutter and routing cables in this case, slightly awkward. The rear panel I/O faces downwards and is awkward to reach. I deliberately used a wireless Corsair mouse and keyboard so I could just plug the dongles in and forget about them. But plugging in anything to the rear I/O once it's all built, that would be painful. You'll be using that front panel I/O. And you can only use an SFX or SFXL power supply. That's limiting, it's going to add to the cost. Thankfully, from the technical point of view, SFX these days does a blooming fine job. Overall, my view would be, actually, if you're going to buy this case, go for the one with the 3 RGB fans in the front, because you're paying a small premium, and if you buy them as accessories they cost an absolute fortune. I like the way it looks with those fans in there. I'm going to give the Corsair 2000D Airflow RGB a worth buying award, an 8 out of 10.